afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to present a body of work that we did as the socio-ecological research unit of KZN Wildlife. What we wanted to look at was how we could integrate community sustainability with conservation goals. Why this was important to us is that we wanted to reduce the human and wildlife conflicts that we saw on the ground, and we also wanted to propose the potential role that conservation could have in benefiting communities and for their benefits. So we did a case study in KZN with Joe Padima heading it, Pindile Kulu, alongside myself. I was interning at the time. So what was important for us as a team was that we had to have a general consensus of what sustainability was. So we both, the three of us agreed that sustainability was the balance of economic, social, and environmental factors. We found that when the economy was healthy, it would feed into society, and if society was well informed and educated about the environment, they could then conserve and make wise choices for conservation. Once having understood what sustainability meant for us as a team, we then looked globally what was the global consensus on conservation and sustainability. We found that South Africa, as signatories to the Convention on Biological Diversity, had key agreements that they had in place for protected area expansion and to improve biological diversity. We also found that there were social objectives along with these biological objectives. These were that this global convention is inspired by the world community's growing commitments to sustainable development and efforts to reduce poverty. So once having agreed on what we thought sustainability was, looking at globally what was actually happening, we then as a conservation authority looked at us and where we stood provincially. We saw that as a unit, what we wanted to achieve, we wanted to build internal capacity to facilitate these alternative livelihoods in order to ensure that sustainability was met. We wanted to ascertain whether participatory methods in biodiversity conservation were actually feasible and the efficacy of these methods. We also wanted to change negative perceptions that are associated with conservation authorities. We found that on the ground, a lot of people found that conservation authorities were very obsessed and concerned with meeting their conservation goals and not as concerned about what the communities adjacent to those goals were doing. So we found that the first thing that we wanted to do was dismantle these perceptions and to actually show communities that not only do we want to meet these conservation objectives, but we also are very concerned about their well-being. The challenges that we faced coming into this project was that conventional conservation methods were a barrier. We found that most approaches were very top-down. There wasn't any participation done with local communities, and so communities weren't aware of what conservation was all about. We also found that 80% of priority biodiversity is actually outside of formerly protected areas, and with only 53% of priority species receiving protection within the existing protected area network. Another key thing that was a challenge for us was that under the Ngonyama Trust, large tracts of land were actually in the hands of traditional councils. What this means is that traditional councils would then be the gatekeepers that were actually blocking us from getting access to communities and actually working with them. So this actually turned out to be one of our major frustrations we had in undertaking this project. So what was the solution? We found that we wanted to go into this area and as a facilitator, we didn't want the community to actually expect anything monetary from us, but we wanted them to understand that what we're coming in to do is actually to open their minds to what conservation is about and what they can do with the resources that they have on their land. The outcomes of us coming in as a facilitator was that we wanted to demonstrate the value of biodiversity to society. So we wanted the community to be aware of what was around them and what value this biodiversity actually had to them. We wanted to win local communities for conservation. We didn't want there to be antagonism between us as conservation authorities and communities. We actually wanted them on board so that we could meet the targets that we had. We also wanted to contribute to local livelihoods. So it was important to us that we empower the community, that by the time we're done with this community, that they actually have things that we've put into place that they can now actually live on, or rather the scarce resources that they do have, how they can better use them. we went in, it was KZN Wildlife in partnership with African Conservation Trust, and that was our partner going into the site. Why did we choose the site? So we chose the Madwaleni area, which is within Mnguni in northern KZN. Why we chose the site in particular is that within this area, there are critical Limbovo cycads that we wanted to conserve. So that was one of the key things in terms of conservation. Secondly, we wanted to develop our water management and delivery system in this area. It's a very arid area, so it was important to us that we alleviate the stress upon the water resources that were there currently. And also, the people would stress over and over again that we need water, so it was key for us to develop our water management system. We also wanted to empower this community. As I said, we were there as facilitators, so we wanted to empower them to understand what they could do with their land. So we wanted to give them advice, help them explore the different land uses that they can actively engage in, and to use the scarce resources that they actually had in order to alleviate poverty. So in the red oval, that's the project area. If you look at this project area, it's south of some kind of game reserve. There's also the Zululand Rhino Reserve adjacent to it. This was key to us because we wanted to provide linkages between these existing reserves and this area, and we wanted to enter into we wanted to introduce a protected environment concept to them. So it was really key to us, particularly also because of the Mnguni River that falls within this area. As I said, we wanted to do a water management system. So because the river was there, we wanted to utilize that resource. The methodology we used going in, we employed participatory biodiversity conservation, which basically means that we wanted to participate with the community in order to bring about these biodiversity conservation targets. So while we use this particular method, we wanted to employ indigenous knowledge. We wanted to actually find out what the community has in their hands and what is their intellectual capacity and what they know and what they can teach us about their own land. We wanted to ascertain the social networks that are existing. This was important because, as I said earlier, we find that the traditional authorities end up being gatekeepers that don't allow us to enter into this area. So we wanted to ascertain the networks that actually are existing in this area in order to work better with them in future. We also wanted to get a timeline out of the community. A timeline basically means we wanted to look at the history and what has been happening in this area. A timeline helps us because it gives us a background of what this community is about and what the challenges that they have and what they're facing. We wanted to go in and explain that we were there as facilitators because we didn't want to have them having expectations from us that we would help them financially. We wanted to perform a needs analysis in this community because we found that often conservation authorities would enter into an area, come up with a plan that they wanted to implement without actually finding out what the needs of the people were. So that was key for us. We wanted to actually find out from the community what their needs were before we did anything. The methodology we used a participatory role appraisal, or PRA in short. The tools within a PRA is the timeline, as I've mentioned. A rich picture. A rich picture simply means that the community would then draw the community what it looked like from their perspective. This was important to us because when they draw the community in how they see it, we get to find out things that we wouldn't have seen had we just simply done a GIS to figure out what the land looks like. We also did a needs analysis and we ranked those needs according to the importance that they stated. We did a Venn diagram. We looked at the institutional structures that exist and how they interlink and how the community feels about the structures that exist. The limitations of this PRA was that we can't really get in-depth information, especially in group settings. People are more shy to speak about things that they feel would be offensive to some that are in the meeting. So what we felt that we had to do was a community profile. So we did a community profile, which was basic random questionnaire administration, just to find out things like education, their skills, their demographics, whether they're employed, water and energy sources, the alternative incomes, their community issues and institutional structures. Things that came up out of the alternative incomes was that some of them were doing hunting, which was illegal, though they did end up confessing to this hunting when they were interviewed one-on-one. So this is the rich picture which they drew. So they would basically draw what they saw on the ground, and what we did is take this information to create a land use plan. So as you can see also, we've got a list of needs which they then gave us of the needs that they had of the community. what we did, we took what they had drawn, overlaid it to what was existing from the maps that we had, and we illustrated the things that they wanted. Of the things that they wanted clinics, which was, it's common in rural communities that the first thing they ask for is a clinic. They wanted schools, they wanted sports ground, they wanted grazing land. So these are the needs that they showed that they had. And as facilitators, our role is then, once we've ascertained what needs they have, is to link them to funders. So that was very key. So that is the land use plan. So what we did with the things that they wanted, we then were able to come in and advise them and say, this is where you could place your grazing land. This is where you could place the school that you want. This is where you could place the clinic that you want. So that was our role, getting from them what they need and then placing it into a land use plan. This is the result of the Venn diagram. We see the distortions even in the institutional structures, how they value the Inkosi as the main and key role player in the area, along with the tribal authority and the councillor in Duna and the identified men's and women's soccer. So we find in this area there aren't a lot of institutional structures. They're not really getting up to much, but what they are getting up to is it was key to them, because as you saw in the needs, they said that we actually need a ground. So it was good for us to know what their needs were. We see even the co-op that they actually had, it was existing, as the co-op is not linked to the other institutional structures that are there, because they basically didn't feel that they had any part in this co-op, and that it was something that they had no say in. So that is why it's actually detached from all the other institutional structures. This is me. I did the community profile in the area. I was accompanied by the councillor. So it's very important when you enter into these areas to actually have someone who's going to come in with you, who they recognize. It gives you more credibility, and then it helps for them to open up to you about what it is that they're facing and what it is that they actually need. Part of the results of the alternative livelihoods, we saw that they were also doing farming. As you can see, the lady, she's doing a bit of subsistence farming, and that is how she basically takes care of her family. With the community profile, no statistical analysis was done, because we just wanted to investigate the basic info and not necessarily the correlation between the variables. The challenge that we had coming into this area was that land that was priority was in the hand of locals and outside of protected area networks. And what we were able to introduce to the community is the notion of a protected environment. Secondly, we wanted to build capacity within the social ecological units, and the groundwork that we did in the form of the PRA helped us to get that capacity. We also wanted to dismantle negative perceptions the community had and have strong relations and communication structures in place. And our success story is that after we were done with the community, they were able to see that the structures that they actually had weren't that good, and they then had a local committee which they formed. We wanted to look at the feasibility of using biodiversity conservation to build sustainable communities. And the result is that when a community is educated about their land, they're able to make decisions for conservation and are able to build sustainably. So having set out to win the communities for conservation, we find that when trust is built, this is possible. You see one of our colleagues, Pindi Leshes, they are doing this consultative work, and the community was very robust in discussions, which was really useful for us. The recommendations that we have in future, based on land use planning, what we conservation authorities can do is to link people with funding. We can also introduce the concept of a protected environment rather than nature reserves. We find that nature reserves aren't necessarily what the people are looking for, because when nature reserves come into an area, the nature reserve may thrive, but the community close to the nature reserve isn't exactly thriving. So it's important that we introduce this concept of protected environments. It's important to do groundwork, because if you don't do groundwork, any developments that you're going to bring into an area aren't really going to reflect the needs of that community. So groundwork is what you do to ascertain whatever it is that you're going to do, it must be efficient and it must actually meet the needs. Time constraints. We find that funders have a particular time that they want funds to be spent, which doesn't go well with this method of participatory biodiversity conservation, because it's an extensive and protracted process that takes a while. So if you want to actually work within the regulations that funders place in, you find that you do shoddy work that doesn't actually reflect the needs of the people on the ground. With some kind of reserve, we saw that we were approached because of the work we're doing in Madwaleni, and they wanted us to help remedy the problem that they had in that area, where the local community is showing resentment to the reserve. Reason being, they're not benefiting from the reserve according to what they see. So we were then approached to come in and almost remedy the situation by bringing in these participatory methods in order to garner what it is that the community actually wanted from the reserve. We recommend using local governance and existing structures, institutional structures. When you come into an area, you don't want to dismantle what is already existing, but you want to build upon it, and you want to strengthen the existing institutional structures. So that is what we found coming into this community. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And sadly, this is the end of our session. It's written here that we must have discussion. Now let's discuss. Okay, the way we're going to have the discussion, I think we had 3